Just a comment about what we have seen up to now this morning and early this afternoon. You know, if I go back 15 years ago, at the time of the debate about the Stern report, on the Stern report, we were debating about the discount rate. And that debate was structured around the Ramsey rule, assuming that there were no single source of uncertainty here. And so I'm very happy to see now, mostly thanks to the people here who are speakers for today, that we were able to move the debate to something much more science-based and related to other fields of economics, in particular asset pricing. So I'm very happy with this outcome, and my paper that I want to present this afternoon is related to this evolution. So several of us already explained that there are different ways to approach the carbon pricing issue. The holy grail in economics, following the lead of Bill Nordhaus, is the cost-benefit analysis, where the price or the value of carbon be the discounted value of the flow of marginal damages. And we have seen many difficulties associated to this approach. It must be continued, and I'm very impressed in particular by what Mike has been able to present this afternoon. But we also need to recognize that there are politicians here around that made decisions in the past, in particular on the occasion of the Paris Agreement. The idea to limit the increase in temperature by not more than 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius. That may not be the optimal target, but that's a target that has been politically decided. And we economists, we need to think about how to translate this target into a carbon value. And there are two ways of approaching this cost efficiency problem. The one is second best, where we try to optimize the use of this intertemporal carbon budget associated to the target. I would call that the cost efficiency approach one. Or the third best approach, which is the one that seems to be followed in France and in Europe, where the politicians do not only determine the target in terms of increased temperature or in terms of carbon budget, they also determine the emission pathway. And the IPCC is also following that kind of thing, the RCP scenarios. So, for example, in Europe, we are now with a target of reducing emission by 55% by the year 2030 compared to 1990, and going to net zero emission by the year 2050. It's a solution where the politicians also determine the trajectory of reduction of emissions. And associated to those targets year by year, there is an associated carbon price, carbon value. So I've been working a lot on the cost-benefit approach, trying to estimate the risk adjustment associated to the climate, this climate problem, what we call the climate discount rate. Today, I would like to estimate to determine or characterize the optimal trajectory, what should be the path of carbon price under the cost efficiency approach number one. That is, suppose that we have a 2-degree target. Associated to that, there is an intertemporal carbon budget that has been estimated in the sixth report of the IPCC to around 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And so answering that question of the optimal allocation of this budget across time would allow me to determine whether those targets year by year, particularly the minus 25% in Europe for the year 2030, is the socially desirable target, or is is it something too ambitious, or where we are following, continuing the waiting game? So, a main result of the paper, I propose a carbon price that would evolve in expectation at a rate of 3.5% per year, so plus inflation. And that 3.5% is related to the interest rate and a risk premium, in fact. Although the issue is not to estimate as a carbon price the present value, the discounted value of the flow of damages, discounting will remain an important issue in this paper too. And that's the main result. So what I will show is that the existing discussion and recommendation that have been made either by the IPCC or by a French commission that have been estimating the carbon price associated to a specific emission pathway, those emission pathways imply that we don't do enough in the short run, that is, the price of carbon is too small, and that's compensated in those reports by having an anticipation of a very large carbon price in the future to make sure that we stay within the 2 degrees Celsius target. So the consequence is that the price of carbon is too small in the short run, too large in the long run. The growth of the carbon price is too large, as I will show. And that implies that we have clearly misallocation of the effort of mitigation over time. So this is an all-dated illustration of this fact. This is for the UK. So the UK is an extreme example for an estimation of the path of the carbon price in the UK, published in 2018. So you see in the central scenario, the carbon price go from, say 13 pounds in 2018, growing to more than 80 pounds by the year 2030. That corresponds to an annual growth rate of 15% per year in real terms. And another, so keep in mind, please, this number. Well, this year, here I'm turned to Ben. They decided to change quite radically this pricing. They're revising every year this process, and this year I don't know exactly what happened, but they radically changed that with a much larger short-term price and a lower growth rate of that price. And I'm very happy with that because that's basically the message of my paper. This is another illustration. So I didn't have time to look at the sixth report of the IPCC. So this is for the fifth report. In the fifth report of the IPCC, there is a database of something like 1,000, how would I say, calibration of different integrated assessment models for different targets in terms of temperature. So here I just look at the 356 calibration of those models that are compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius, corresponding probably to something like 450 ppm concentration of CO2. So if I limit the analysis to this 356 calibration, here is the recommended growth rate of carbon price over the period 2020-2050. And so you see that, in fact, look just at the mean. The mean is a growth rate, an annual growth rate of the carbon price of mostly 8%. Okay, with a lot of disagreement, but let me focus on this mean. So growth rate of the carbon price, something like 8%. One last example is for France. So that was already mentioned by Maureen. There has been a commission under the leadership of Alain Quinet, this report, that produced a report named Report Quinet 2, published in 2019 that answered the question from the government of what should be the path of carbon price in order to reduce emission by the year 2030 by something like 40% at that time, and going to a reduction by 80% by the year 2050. And they answered the question in that way. We should have a carbon price for France around 69 euros per ton of CO2 by that year, growing to something like, in expectation, 775 euros per ton of CO2 by the year 2050. So that also corresponds to a growth rate of 8% per year. So I would like to focus on the issue of, is this growth rate around 8% per year for the carbon price something that is compatible with an efficient allocation of the effort of mitigation over time? Do we do not enough in the short run, expecting them to do much more in the future, in particular for people who are techno-optimists, I would say, waiting for emergence of good technologies that will reduce the marginal abatement cost by a large fraction in order to reduce the cost of the transition. So that's the issue. Well, all those models are those from the IPCC at least, and the ones used by the Kinet 2 Commission, they were all with no uncertainty. Okay, so they produce carbon price that are basically riskless. So if I look at specifically the Kinet 2 reports, this means that, remember, I mean, if this is a cost efficiency approach, this is not cost benefit. Those carbon prices are not the present value of the future marginal damages. They are carbon value associated to, a shadow price associated to a quantity constraint on intertemporal emissions. So under this carbon budget constraint, moving the efforts of reducing emission by 1 ton over time we should be collectively indifferent at the margin to transfer this effort over time in order to get an optimal solution. Okay, so this indifference means that we should be indifferent to the solution consisting in emitting 1 ton of CO2 less today, that will allow me to emit 1 more ton by the year 2050. So if I increase my effort of reduction by 1 ton today, it will cost me the marginal abatement cost, which should be the carbon price, that is 69 euros, suppose I'm in the year 2020. That will cost us collectively 69 euros, and that will generate the benefit by the year 2050 of the marginal abatement cost, because it will allow me to emit 1 more ton of CO2 at that time. It's a transfer of the effort over time. So in short, I should be indifferent to invest or not in this project that costs me 69 euros today and that will generate a benefit of 775 euros in 30 years from now. I should be indifferent at the margin about that, meaning if you look at this investment, indifference would mean zero net present value, and you get a zero present value for something that costs you 69 euros today and generate a benefit of 775 euros in 30 years from now, if and only if you use a discount rate of 8%. Okay? So that corresponds to the growth rate of the carbon price, exactly. So really, do you think that in this risk-free world, we should use a discount rate of 8%? We should be indifferent to something that costs us as little as 69 euros today to generate such a large benefits of 775 euros in 30 years of now? Of course not. And in particular, if this thing is risk-free. Okay? Having a rate of return of 8% is extremely large. So this is not efficient. So in fact, here I'm just telling you another illustration of the hoteling rules. Okay, in this framework where you have a fixed budget, intertemporal budget, is similar to, you know, a mine of inexhaustible resources and determining at which rate you should extract this resource, exactly the hoteling rule. We know that the price of these resources should grow at the risk-free rate. Okay, and the risk-free rate these days is obviously not 8% per year. Okay, so we are not at the optimal, and we are not at the optimum. The optimum under this framework should have to have a price of carbon growing at the risk-free rate, and the risk-free rate these days is not 8%, it's something like 1% or something like that for those horizons. So meaning the growth rate of carbon price should be much smaller, and remember that implied that you should have, if this is the Keynes 2 proposal for the growth of the carbon price over time, reducing the growth of the carbon price should imply that you should have a much larger price for carbon today. That will allow you to have a much smaller carbon price in the future. So meaning the Keynes 2 Commission answering to the wrong question, the third best problem, which is associated to a predetermined, politically determined emission pathway. So we are playing the waiting game. We do not allocate efficiently the effort of reducing emissions in the right way. We postpone too much of the effort to the future. That's the problem. Okay. Well, of course, however, this problem that I just presented in the framework of no uncertainty make little sense. In particular, in the Keynes 2 Commission, they make obvious assumption. I don't know exactly which one, but by of course, if they hide this number there, they are making assumption about the marginal abatement cost function by the year 2050. So they make assumption about the speed of technological progress for the next 30 years to get to those numbers. And of course, these integrated assessment models make assumption on technological progress. Do they do learning by doing, or do they do endogenous growth? Well, I don't know the details, but at least we should recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty associated to that. And here is an illustration of that. So I go back to the database of the IPCC fifth report, and I took again, here I took the 374 estimates of carbon price for the year 2030. That is associated to this objective of long-term concentration of CO2 that I believe is the 2 degrees Celsius target. So this is the density function, the frequency of the marginal abatement cost or carbon price by the year 2030, estimated at the time of the publication of the fifth report, that was 2015. So it's a 15 years ahead projection estimation of the carbon price necessary in 15 years in order to be compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius. And you see there is very large disagreement among experts about what should be that price. Okay, so there are models assuming that we will basically not need any carbon price to get to the objective, and there are others that estimate very large carbon price by the year 2030 in order to get to the objective. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and of course, when you think about that, when you talk to engineers and any experts recognize that there is such a large uncertainty about the cost of decarbonizing different sectors, not only electricity, but mobility and residential. There are huge uncertainty. What will be the marginal abatement cost associated to capture and sequestration? What will be the actual cost of renewables, given the fact that we are currently not being able to solve the intermittency problem? What will be the cost of hydrogen solution? What will be the cost of batteries and things like that? So there are huge uncertainty associated to that. And therefore, my arguments based on the hoteling rule to say that the carbon price should grow at the risk-free rate should be adapted to the recognition of this source of uncertainty. of those sorts of uncertainty. And they are not only uncertainty associated to the development of green innovation, there is also uncertainty about the prosperity for the next 30 years. If we got to learn that there is much more growth of consumption in the future in the business as usual, there will be more emission, and therefore we will have to implement more mitigation effort to get to the outcome of limiting the increased temperature by 2 degrees Celsius, and therefore the marginal amendment cost will be larger. So growth uncertainty has also an impact on those issues. Okay, so how should I adapt the hoteling rules, that is to determine the growth rate of the carbon price, taking into account of this uncertainty? Well, suppose that there is a positive correlation between the marginal abatement cost and in aggregate consumption. Okay, so that is, in 2050, state with a large consumption is associated to state with a large marginal abatement cost. Well, in that situation, reducing more emission right now is less useful because it does not provide a kind of insurance against the bad state of nature. Okay? After all, marginal abatement costs will be smaller in the bad state of nature. So I should not care too much about climate change, and I could delay the efforts, okay? And so I could have a relatively low price of carbon today and so compensate that with the larger expected growth rate of carbon price. Okay, so you see, that means that the hoteling rule should indeed take into account of this correlation, exactly as Rick presented this morning, for example, in a more general framework, and in the first best framework, cost benefit. So that's the idea I want to develop. Of course, the issue, exactly as this morning in Rick's presentation, the most important issue then is to determine whether there is a positive or a negative correlation between consumption and future marginal abatement cost. Okay, and there I will tell you the problem. There are different possible stories, and therefore the theory cannot tell you whether adapting the hoteling rule to the case of uncertainty should magnify the problem of expressed earlier, that is the 8% observed increase of carbon growth rate of the carbon price. Does uncertainty explain why we go to this 8% or make the puzzle even stronger? Okay, so my paper has different sections. I will just cover one of them. It's a section where I calibrate a simple two-period models. I'm sorry, this is not very prestigious in terms of numerical analysis, but at least it provides the basic story of what's the correlation between marginal abatement cost and consumption in this kind of second best approach of carbon pricing. But other section of the paper cover a more general approach. Okay, so my model is very simple. As I just said, there are just two periods. In period one, in the business as usual, you produce Y0. And from this wealth, you can use some of it to abate your economy, to abate emission in your economy. So K0 is the abatement effort, and A of K0 is the cost of that effort. Of course, the function A0 is increasing in convex. Same thing for the second period. In the second period, you produce Y1, and from Y1, you must subtract the cost of abatement in order to determine the level of consumption. Okay, and you need to determine the optimal abatement strategy, K0 and K1, that maximize the intertemporal expected utility under the assumption that in each state of the world, the total emission net of the recycling of CO2 from the atmosphere from emission in the first period, that the total emission is smaller than the carbon budget, the interval carbon budget T. So how do you emit in the first period? Well, there is, in the business as usual, there is a standard GDP, carbon intensity Q0 of GDP. So that's the business as usual emission. From that business as usual emission, you subtract the quantity abated in the first period, and you do the same thing in the second period. In the first period, there is this natural decay of CO2 from the atmosphere. Source of uncertainty. Well, what are the sources of uncertainty? GDP in the second period, production in the second period is uncertain. There is uncertainty about the total factor productivity. There is uncertainty about the technology available in the second period. The theta is a parameter that affects the abatement cost function in the second period. So there is technological uncertainty in this model. And also in the model, I calibrate some uncertainty about the reality of the carbon budget constraint. Okay, but that's less, that does not play really a role in the calibration. Okay, so I solve this problem numerically. So I make assumption about the distribution of future total factor productivity. I make an assumption about the technological uncertainty. I solve this problem. I determine the optimal abatement strategy over the two periods. Of course, K1 is uncertain. And I determine the carbon price in each of the two periods that support the optimal solution. So this is a calibration exercise. Well, yes, okay. Let me give you the flavor, the two mechanisms that are at work that determine this correlation, the sign of the correlation between consumption and the marginal abatement cost on the carbon price. In fact, there are two drivers to these things. The first drivers generate a negative correlation story. And this negative correlation story is based on the assumption that the main source of uncertainty is technological. So suppose that the only source of uncertainty is model is technology. We don't know what will be the abatement cost in the second period to attain the objective. Okay, so in that framework where the only source of uncertainty is technological, put yourself in a scenario where you observe that green innovation is stronger than expected. So if green innovation are stronger than expected, at the same time consumption will be large, okay, because innovation will generate a smaller cost of transition, and the smaller cost of transition imply that you will have to abate less in the future. You will not have to abate less. You will incur smaller costs associated to this abatement, and that will imply that your consumption will be larger. At the same time, as the marginal abatement cost will be smaller because of the green innovation. So you see a negative correlation between the marginal abatement cost and consumption. Okay? And therefore, in that framework, abating more today is a way to hedge future macroeconomic risk. Okay? And so, meaning you should do more of it in the short run because of this additional value of this effort for managing risk at the aggregate level. And so a larger carbon price in the short run, and therefore a smaller growth rate of that carbon price. Okay, so that's the story of a negative correlation. And so in that framework, the Kineto puzzle becomes even stronger with the growth rate of the carbon price, which should be even smaller than the risk-free rate, and therefore even smaller than the 8% observed recommended by the Kineto Commission or the IPCC of the fifth report of the IPCC. There is another story with the opposite effect. Okay, a positive correlation story is the one where you suppose that the main source of uncertainty is prosperity. Suppose that we don't know what will be the TFP, the growth rate of the total factor productivity in the future, and put yourself in a positive scenario, as before. Here, the positive scenario is you observe a larger economic growth than expected. So in that framework, of course, consumption is larger. At the same time, the marginal abatement cost will also be larger. Why? Because in the business as usual, you will emit more CO2, and therefore you will have to abate more. And because the marginal abatement cost curve is increasing, the marginal abatement cost will be larger. And so you have a positive correlation here between the marginal abatement cost and aggregate consumption that imply that abating more in the short run has no hedging benefits. There is no insurance benefit for the future generation. And so you should care less about climate change in the short run. That implies that you should allow for a smaller carbon price in the short run and therefore a larger expected growth rate of carbon price. And that may be a reason to justify Kinet 2. Maybe indeed if the socially desirable growth rate of carbon price in expectation could be as large as 8%. So here two questions. First, which of the two stories is the most important one? And second question is if the positive correlation story is the relevant one. Is it strong enough to justify Kinet 2? Or IPCC. Okay? So I will not go into the details of the calibration. Let me just observe that this negative correlation story is probably relatively weak in intensity. Okay, here, the correlation that is generated by the story is that the cost of the transition will be smaller in the good scenario with the large green innovation, and that generates this negative correlation. But remember, the energy sector represents only 4-5%, that was mentioned this morning, of the total economy. So even a reduction in this cost of the transition will not represent hundreds of billions in difference in aggregate consumption. Remember, the numbers for the French economy is that the energy transition for the next 20 years will cost something like 40, 50, 60 billion euros per year. So that's not enormous compared to the aggregate GDP of 2.5 trillion euros. So probably this story has little effect. That generates some correlation, but when you compare to this positive correlation story, when you think about the intensity of the uncertainty related to the total factor productivity, that's much larger. And as a consequence, when I calibrate my model, I obtain that this story is the dominating one. So I will not go into the details of the calibration. Let me just mention two things. First thing, I use the Barrow story in order to have asset prices, because you see here my issue is that for RIC, we need to have a carbon pricing mechanism that is aligned with the standard asset pricing of other assets in the economy in order to have some coherence or consistency between pricing different assets. At the end of the day, if you decentralize the energy transition through a carbon market for permits of emissions of CO2, you need this asset, the permit, that you can bank and trade on markets. You need that the pricing of those permits is consistent with the price of other assets in the economy. So it's crucially important to have a risk-free rate and a risk premium from the model that is related to what we observe on the market. And so we do that. I do that with using the possibility of extreme events. And I think Rick has exactly the same approach in his paper that he presented this morning. And the other issue is how to calibrate uncertainty on the technologies and on the future marginal abatement cost. And so to calibrate that thing, I just use the graph that I presented earlier on what's in the fifth report of the IPCC, what's the standard deviation of the estimated carbon price by the year 2030 from the point of view of experts making those evaluations in 2015. Because in my model, I represent this model is calibrated in two periods of 15 years, the period 2020 to 2034, and then from 2035 to 2050. So you have a time path of 15 years. So the outcome of this calibration, well, here is Monte Carlo simulation. I mean, some of the points of my Monte Carlo simulation, you see a positive correlation between the observed future carbon aggregate consumption and the marginal abatement cost, A prime. And so there is a positive correlation, and therefore there is no insurance benefits of imposing a strong early energy transition, and that justify having a relatively small carbon price and a relatively large growth rate of carbon price, at least a carbon price that grows at a rate which is larger than the risk-free rate. And I will not go into the details of the outcome of my simulation, but I get a growth rate of the carbon price around 3.5% in an economy where the risk-free rate is something like 1% and the risk premium, the aggregate risk premium, is something like 2.5%. So that duplicate what we observe, what we have been observing over the last centuries in terms of carbon pricing. The beta of my efforts of an early mitigation effort is close to 1. Okay, so that was also something that Rick mentioned earlier today. So let me finish with this conclusion. If I go back to IPCC, okay, the fifth report, where on average models recommend having a small carbon price today and a growth rate around 8% per year, I tell myself IPCC also plays the waiting game. Okay, they mention we will have on the emission pathway that are examined by the IPCC impose not enough effort in the short run, but compensate that with a large growth rate of carbon price. Okay, and I believe it's a problem. I mean, if IPCC I know that IPCC is not very strong in recommending carbon pricing, but when they in the few extract of those reports that talk about carbon pricing, the outcome is don't look at that. It's too small. If really the objective is to allocate efforts of mitigation over time with the target of 2 degrees Celsius. Thank you very much. So.